Hello, everyone. Welcome to our seminar, The Humanitarian Crisis in Afghanistan, Toward a Long-Term Solution. It's co-sponsored by the Russian International Affairs Council and the Schiller Institute. I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute, and I will moderate our event. Since the abrupt withdrawal of the US NATO forces from Afghanistan following the August 15, 2021 Taliban takeover of Kabul, there have been very clear warnings that unless a major relief effort was launched, the people of Afghanistan would face a devastating humanitarian crisis. Well, 6 months have passed, and that crisis is here. People are now dying from hunger, from disease, and from exposure to a cold winter. We've brought together a panel of experts to address the following issues. What are the causes of this crisis? What are the geopolitical implications of a failed state in Afghanistan? What is needed to reverse the immediate threat of mass starvation and refugee problems? And finally, a long-term solution, the role of the global powers. We will begin with opening remarks from Dr. Andrey Kortunov, the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, and he'll be followed by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the President of the Schiller Institute. Andrey? Make sure you unmute yourself.
Thank you, Harley. Let me say that we are approximately 6 months after Taliban got to power in Kabul. And I think all of us can recall quite vividly all the predictions that were made in August and in September of last year. Some of them turned out to be right, some of them turned out to be wrong. But let me just give you a couple of my observations on what could have happened in Afghanistan and what actually didn't happen over the last 6 months. First of all, 6 months ago, there were expectations that probably Taliban would move towards a more inclusive government, and that after some period of the interim leadership, we would see a more representative leadership in Afghanistan that would include ethnic minorities of the country. First of all, the Tajik minority, but not only. That would include not only Sunnis, but Shia, and that would be more gender balanced. I think right now we can argue that these expectations did not come true. And the interim government that was established in September and in October of last year is still in place, and it's very unlikely that this government will change significantly. So those who expected that Taliban would somehow significantly moderate its positions on issues of human rights and gender equality and other fundamental issues turned out to be wrong. So I don't think that we have any reasons to believe that Taliban will undergo any abrupt and quick transformation from what it used to be before it took power to something very different. And I think it's understandable, because if Taliban were to move away from the fundamental principles of the movement, the odds are that quite soon it would be replaced by other groups which are even more fundamentalist and more radical in terms of how they see the future of the country. My second observation is related to what Harley has just mentioned, the humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan. And I do recall quite vividly that 6 months ago, there were many speculations that the winter of 2021-2022 would be a disaster, that we would see a lot of people dying from hunger, from the deficit of basic medicines, from the shortages of fuel in large metropolitan areas, and the country will be sucked into the situation of chaos and disintegration. I don't want to underestimate the human suffering in Afghanistan. Definitely takes place. Definitely there are deficits of food and fuel and medical care. However, I think that right now we can argue that Afghanistan has demonstrated a significant degree of resilience, especially when we're talking about rural areas, especially when we're talking about northern and eastern provinces of Afghanistan that were the most vulnerable in terms of the implications of the change of power in Kabul. The situation clearly is not bright, and it's likely to deteriorate further. However, I think it's fair to say that Afghanistan survived this half year, and to some extent, we can argue that things might get slightly better in spring with the new agricultural season in place, with the new relations with neighboring countries. So the situation is difficult, but the situation is not really critical for the survival of the current leadership in Afghanistan. My third point is related to the opposition. And again, 6 months ago, there were expectations and maybe even hopes that the opposition would challenge the power of Taliban, that we would see many places where the power of Taliban is likely to be shattered or questioned. But I think that right now, after half a year of Taliban staying in power, we can conclude that the current leadership was able to consolidate the power in its hands, and that the enclaves of opposition are relatively small, and there is no real challenge to the power of Taliban so far. Neither the supporters of the former leadership, nor followers of ISIS Khorasan, nor fighters of Al-Qaeda were in a position to question the control of power by Taliban, and this is likely to stay, at least in the immediate future. So I think that we can argue that Taliban has been in a position to consolidate its power, and there are no really significant challengers who might question this situation anytime soon. Now, I think that also if we look back into the international discussions on Taliban in summer or in early fall of last year, many thought that probably the international community would come with a consolidated approach to Afghanistan, and that before too long we would see new United Nations Security Council resolutions on how to deal with Taliban. The international community would probably agree on the list of demands that should create a platform for negotiations with Taliban. However, that has not happened. Unfortunately, in my view at least, unfortunately, the international community is as divided on Afghanistan as it was 6 months ago. I don't think that we have any consensus on how we should address Taliban and how long or how short the list of our demands to Taliban should be. So there is some very, very, very general common denominator, but nothing really not a lot beyond this very general common denominator. And finally, and I will probably end with that, let me say that there were speculations that probably in half a year we would see a chain of international recognition of Taliban, that many countries, starting with neighboring states, but also Eurasian states around Taliban, around Afghanistan, would opt for a formal diplomatic recognition of the country, and we would see a kind of, at least, a number of important international players engaging into formal negotiations on establishing diplomatic relations with the regime in Kabul. And that has not happened either. I think that now it's fair to say that no one is in a rush to recognize Taliban. Nobody is in a hurry to establish diplomatic relations with this country, with this specific regime. But at the same time, many players, including Pakistan, China above all, but also Russia, and Gulf states and Turkey and many others, are trying to keep the channels of communications open, and they have their own links to Taliban, which allow them to stay more or less informed about the developments in the country. And finally, and I will end with that. I think that as far as Russia is concerned, the events in Afghanistan should be considered through the lens of the recent developments in Kazakhstan, because many in this country believe that the crisis in Kazakhstan make the country, and maybe even in a more general sense, the Central Asian region at large, more vulnerable to potential spillover effects coming from the south. So that creates another incentive for Central Asian countries to work closely with Russia and arguably with China on securing their positions and promoting their safety nets in dealing with the potential challenges that might come from the territory of Afghanistan. We clearly see divergent attitudes to Afghanistan from a number of Central Asian states, most notably the disagreements between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan on how we should approach Afghanistan and Taliban in particular. And definitely these differences will not fade away. They're likely to be with us in the foreseeable future. Let me stop here and let me say that I'm looking forward to a productive and a candid discussion of this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrey. And now we'll hear from Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and president of the Schiller Institute.
Well, hello, Harley. Hello, Andrew, Andrey. Well, I have a little bit a different view. I think that whoever is responsible for the adoption of the sanctions against Afghanistan and for the freezing of the Afghan assets in the United States and in Europe after the Taliban takeover in August is also responsible for the following. According to the German UNICEF head, Christian Schneider, 1 million children under the age of 5 are acutely undernourished in Afghanistan. And their condition is such that in Germany, they would have to be treated in an intensive care unit, which means that under the current circumstances, they are likely to die. According to the United Nations, 8.7 million people are in an advanced state of starvation. 24.4 million, or 55% of the population, are in an emergency situation, which means they lack all the basic necessities of life, while 98% do not have enough to eat. More and more families are selling some of their children in the hope that the others will survive, and people are selling their organs. Also, the mass media in the United States and Europe, following a brief hype in August and early September, have reported almost nothing about this worst humanitarian crisis on the globe. The leaders of those NATO countries that withdrew so hastily from Afghanistan in August knew, of course, that 80% of the country's budget came from aid provided by donor countries, and that the combination of the cancellation of these funds, the freezing of Afghan capital, and the sanctions would strangle Afghanistan economy overnight. After 6 months of unfolding tragedy and countless appeals that were in vain, except for a few recent small concessions, one must ask what the intent of this policy is. The argument that the Taliban first have to recognize the rights of women and so on becomes absurd when those women and their children are dead. Is it the intent to sabotage the Taliban's ability to maintain a functioning state to such an extent that the opposition, including ISIS, Al-Qaeda, drug traffickers, warlords, etc., gain the upper hand? The consequence would be a new and bloody civil war, a hell in which the civilian population, between hunger, freezing temperatures, COVID, epidemics such as polio, measles, dengue fever, and diarrhea, will be crushed, and millions of refugees will attempt to seek safety in neighboring countries and in Europe. That would be the continuation of the British Empire's Great Game of Bernard Lewis and Zbigniew Brzezinski, which aims to ensure the geopolitical destabilization of Russia and China and to prevent the economic integration of Eurasia through the Belt and Road Initiative by using the old instruments of terrorism, opium wars, and ethnic conflicts. Should this policy, quote, succeed, it would be just one more element in the great final act of mankind's tragedy, which is now playing out on the stage of world history between the adversaries of the West and Russia and China, and which has now reached a point described by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists as 100 seconds before midnight on the doomsday clock. There is a counter-concept for saving Afghanistan, which I have named Operation Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina, who lived some 1,000 years ago, was one of the greatest physicians of universal history, whose canon of medicine remained in part a reference until the 18th century. Ibn Sina was born in what is now Uzbekistan. His father came from Balkh in Afghanistan. In times of the corona pandemic, it is extremely important to remember that it was he who recognized, among other things, the immense importance of quarantine in combating epidemics. In addition to being an outstanding Renaissance man, he can become a symbolic figure for saving Afghanistan. Operation Ibn Sina can bring about a change for the better in two ways. First, it can become a synonym for international cooperation in building a modern healthcare system and providing food for the Afghan people. If all the neighboring countries, as well as the United States and European nations, which fought in Afghanistan for 20 years as part of NATO, and therefore have a moral obligation that cries out to heaven, help the people out of this undeserved acute distress and cooperate in a crash aid program, the worst can still be averted. In addition to the humanitarian aspect, Operation Ibn Sina would also have a military strategic dimension. If Russia, China, the US, and India, the four nations with the greatest military and economic importance or size of population, could cooperate, this would become a confidence-building measure for resolving the major strategic conflicts. Afghanistan unlike the strategic importance of Ukraine or Taiwan, is not one of the core interests of Russia and China. It is many thousands of miles away from the United States, while India, on the other hand, has a core interest in the stability of its geographic surroundings. The cooperation among these four powers, together with the mobilization of other formats that exist, such as the Troika Plus, the SCO, and the OIC, with the aim of saving Afghanistan, can be a step towards the new paradigm in international relations. Without it will not be possible to come to a lasting survival of humanity. There is no place on this earth, and that includes the strategically explosive potential of destabilization operations around Ukraine and Taiwan, where the moral fitness to survive of the human species is more tested than in Afghanistan. It is not our security that we need to defend in the Hindu Kush, as the then German Defense Minister Peter Struck had claimed on the 11th of March 2004 to motivate German participation in the Afghan war, but it is our humanity. Military strategists are invited to take into account what might be an unfamiliar domain in strategic thinking, the moral condition of the population, both their own population and their adversaries. When the French Revolution failed due to the Jacobin terror, Friedrich Schiller found that a great moment had found a small race, that also the objective opportunity existed, the subjective moral capacity was lacking. He then wrote the aesthetic letters with the conviction that from now on, any improvement in the political sphere would only be possible through the ennoblement of the character of the individual. He considered that the education of the capacity of the Empfindungsvermögen, of empathy, is the most pressing need of the times, because it awakens the improvement in understanding. From this perspective, overcoming the depraved indifference in parts of the population, which makes them equally insensitive to the suffering of other peoples and to the effects of their geopolitically motivated demonization of the supposed enemy, is a strategic factor of the highest order. Operation Ibn Sina should therefore become the flag under which all forces unite who want to save the Afghan people out of agape, who want to bring about a new paradigm in strategic relations as the means of final overcoming the threat of war, and who want to defend the humanity of our species. Thank you.
Thank you, Helga. Now we'll hear from our panel of experts. Each will speak for 10 minutes so we can maximize the time for discussion at the end of their comments. I think we'll start with James Jatras, a former US diplomat, former advisor to the Republican leadership in the US Senate. And the title of his talk is Stop the Continuing War on Afghanistan. Jim?
Thank you, Harley. And I think Andrey and Helga for their remarks and for my being invited to say a few words today. What I have to say is less perhaps of a presentation and more of a commentary and a few observations from what has just been said. We're all familiar with the so-called Pottery Barn rule that Colin Powell enunciated sometime around the invasion of Iraq. You break it, you pay for it. In a sense, I guess we did pay for Iraq many, many times over without much of anything to show for it. I think we can say the same thing about Afghanistan, in the sense that we have put tens of billions of dollars into that country over the years. I think the estimates run up to close to $1 trillion, what do we have to show for it except for a country that remains broken? One thing that has not really been mentioned here so far is the fact that we're talking about the state of a country after 20 years of an occupation and civil war following a conquest by the United States and its allies, principally Great Britain, but also then turn into a NATO mission. And what do we have to show for it at the end of the day? A broken country. We can talk about relief or providing some kind of alleviation of the suffering of the Afghan people. And I think Helga has pointed out a very wise plan about how this could be done if there was an agreement among the major players in the international community. The trouble is we're not just talking about a failure to do something good, a failure to provide a relief. We're also talking about an active attempt to increase the suffering of the Afghan people. Let's start with the fact that we've got something like $9 billion in the Afghan central bank that is frozen. That is Afghan money, admittedly donated by other countries, since the economy of that country really isn't viable at this point. But nonetheless, it's money that in principle belongs to Afghanistan. It is not available for any uses there. We have other problems, of course. Let's not forget all the military equipment we left behind that we have no idea in whose hands that's eventually going to fall. I suppose that's a source of funds for the Taliban now if they want to use it. Let's also keep in mind, too, that the question of recognition of the Taliban as the new government, I could understand the hesitancy of countries to do that. If I were to get up in the morning and decide what kind of government I would like to see in power in Kabul, the Taliban would not be it. On the other hand, that's what we've got. I don't know if there's much of a prospect for anything else to take their place after 20 years of trying to put together an alternative order in Afghanistan. Yes, it would be nice if they were more inclusive. Yes, it would be nice if they were nicer to minorities and women and so forth. But I think, as Andrey pointed out, there's probably a limit to what they can do exactly, given their constituency and the fact that there are more radical elements within Afghanistan that presumably would capitalize on supposed weakness if they went too far in the direction of tolerance and inclusion. In any case, yeah, these are hard decisions that the international community has got to make, but I think we need to look past the individual decisions to see what is the mentality, particularly of the Western powers that have made such a mess of Afghanistan over all these years. And it seems to me there's an element of vindictiveness here that just as we saw in Germany after World War I, with the continuing blockade of that country, even after the armistice, and tens of thousands of deaths by starvation as a result, that there seems to be a mentality among some Western policymakers that says, well, we couldn't win, but at least we can destroy the country. We can make a total mess of it. We can make sure they can't reconstruct. I think we see this to a great extent in Syria. It's pretty clear that the government of al-Assad has won the war, but nonetheless, we can't let go. We can't lift the sanctions. We can't stop our efforts to try to disrupt that country and to inflict suffering on the Syrian people. I think, again, we need to look at what got us into Afghanistan in the first place, which, by the way, wasn't just a response to 9/11. It had nothing to do with fighting terrorism. It was, as Colonel Larry Wilkerson, the former chief of staff to Colin Powell, pointed out, it was geopolitical. It was to insert American forces into the most difficult place in the planet to get American forces into for geostrategic reasons, above all, to disrupt the integration of Eurasia and be in a position to do that, especially to give the Chinese a very difficult time in their most vulnerable province, which I guess we shouldn't name because that would subject us to probably censorship on some of the platforms. And and this is part of the pattern of how we look at various American and NATO interventions, whether we're talking about against Serbia over Kosovo in 1999, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and so forth, that playing these geostrategic games at the expense of the people of the region that is the object of the military and action and the sanctions and so forth, is really what the root the problem is, rather than what Helga is proposing, which is a civilized, cooperative way to address the real needs of these regions in a way that does not inflame the overall global situation. I think Andrey's remarks, in a sense, presume that kind of goodwill among the players. And that's where I think the problem remains, is I just don't see any kind of indication from Washington that, and to a lesser extent perhaps from the Europeans, that they're prepared to do that they're still looking at Russia and China with respect to a zero-sum game of influence, a continuation, if you will, of the great game going back to the 19th century, rather than saying, how do we stabilize this area? How can we do what's best for the people of this region? And if that means coming into an accord with Moscow and Beijing, that would be a good thing, not a bad thing. And I don't think we're there yet. I hope there are minds in Washington that are amenable to seeing reason, to seeing the demands of humanity when it comes to Afghanistan and other regions, whether we're talking about Ukraine or Kazakhstan and other places, the Balkans, which shows signs of heating up again, but we're not there yet. And so I think this conference is an excellent effort to try to put onto the table some productive proposals that can help get us from where we are now, where we should be, but we're not there yet. But anyway, thank you for inviting me to participate, and I look forward to hearing the other comments.
Thank you, Jim. Next, we'll move to Temur Umarov, who is a fellow at the Carnegie Moscow Center. Temur, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the introductory remarks, and Jim, thank you for your presentation. That was really insightful. I want to start by saying a very simple thing. The Afghan crisis is very complicated. I don't think that there is anyone inside Afghanistan or outside of it who knows how to solve it, or who can predict what the future is going to hold for Afghanistan, even in short term. This is, of course, a country that suffered a lot, not only for the last 20 years, but also for the last maybe 40 years or even more. And because of the situation inside of this country, and because of the big involvement of foreign countries in domestic issues of Afghanistan, there is no real, instrument or even behavior that Afghan society has created on its own that can enable the country to survive, especially when we are living in a very difficult and hectic times today. Let's just not forget that Afghanistan people are suffering right now, not only with the consequences of political crisis, but also with the COVID, with ecological problems that the whole region of Central Asia is suffering right now, and many other issues. And those problems are happening simultaneously, and it's really difficult to manage them when you don't have a stable country, a stable government, and the government that is not, that is not respected, or even the government that is seen as illegitimate in other places of the world. And of course, we can understand international community that faces a dilemma of, on the one hand, seeing that the Afghanistan is in the middle of crisis, and on the other hand, knowing that the Taliban is a fundamental radical terrorist group that came to power and did so not using some kind of legitimate instruments like voting or anything like that, but came using its power, and because of it is the only group that can hold on to power in this country. But on the other hand, we see that the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is devastating, and it's not going to get better if the international community and the countries that are involved in Afghan crisis will not act right now. I'm not saying that pouring money into Afghan economy can solve all of its problems, but it can really help to get over the humanitarian crisis right now. And actually, if we take a look at this from the point of view of long-term consequences, it can be helpful for the stability in the whole region. What I'm saying is that if the international community and greater powers will not act right now and will not push to at least let Afghanistan use its own money that is frozen right now, the humanitarian crisis could get worse, and it can create a lot more problems for all of the countries that are neighbors of Afghanistan, and as a consequence, problem for other great powers in Eurasia. The situation right now seems like a no way out route for the Taliban, and it at the same time creates frustration inside of the government, and as we all know, the Taliban is not the very consolidated group in Afghanistan, and they have their own different opinions inside of this group. And with the crisis unfolding in Afghanistan, it gives more upper hand in making decisions to the more radical part of the Taliban that do not believe in diplomacy, that do not see the way out of the situation in negotiations with other countries, that don't want to wait for help from other countries, and want just to rule as the Taliban did in the 90s, when for a short period of time Taliban was in the government. So this creates a dilemma, and if there will not be taken any steps to solving short-term problems and crisis that we see ad hoc right now, it can and for sure will have its impact on the long-term problems of Afghanistan. But when we talk about what countries might have their influence on the resolvement of Afghan crisis, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is big powers like Russia or China. We're not talking about the US right now, because the US obviously has shown that they're not interested in being involved in this crisis anymore. But Russia and China kind of don't have any other options. They are living very closely to Afghanistan, and they have to do something at least to secure themselves. And actually that is what they are doing. I'm not, I don't believe that Russia and China are interested in getting involved into Afghanistan's domestic issues too much and being ready to solve the Afghan crisis in the long term. Russia and China want Afghanistan's borders to be secured, and the only thing they want is to have the guarantees that any crisis that Afghanistan faces will stay in Afghanistan. It will not cross the border and come to the region of Central Asia and later on to the borders of Russia and China. But if we look at what regional smaller players are saying, we will see the difference here in the approach of resolvement of Afghan crisis. And here I talk about Uzbekistan's position on Afghanistan, which is a unique one in Eurasia. Uzbekistan for a long time, even before the Afghan crisis, has been clear that, first of all, it sees Afghanistan as a part of Central Asia, that Uzbekistan wants Afghanistan to be involved more actively and dynamically in economic circle of Central Asia. And Uzbekistan really wants to see Afghanistan as a stable, growing country in any terms, from economic and political development and etc. This is what I think the approach should be from other countries, but unfortunately, many countries are, this is logical, and any country is, when it comes to foreign policy, seeks its own pragmatic goals. And I'm not criticizing anyone, but at this moment, there is no intention from the bigger powers with bigger resources and might in international community that really want to get involved in in resolvement of Afghanistan crisis in long term, except for regional powers. So I think we also should, when we talk about the future of Afghanistan, we should not ignore the willingness and the ability of smaller regional countries to be involved in this issue and to pay more attention in our analysis to countries of Central Asia. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Temur. Now we're going to go to Graham Fuller, who served for 25 years as an operations officer in the CIA, and after retiring, 4 years as vice chair of the National Intelligence Council. Graham, the floor is yours. Make sure you unmute yourself.
There. Can you hear me?
Yes, fine,
Yeah.
Loud and clear.
I would just like to say a couple of words in Russian for reasons that I will explain in a moment. Вот почему я хочу сказать несколько слов на русском языке. Потому что когда я работал как разведчик в Афганистане, это было уже почти 40 лет тому назад, я больше всего занимался тем, что делают русские, так сказать, тогда советское присутствие в Афганистане, больше, чем я занимался тем, что происходит в Афганистане самом. Так, я думаю, что это начало вот большой проблемы, что мы видим на международной уровне теперь. Okay, I just wanted to say a few words in Russian, simply to say that when I was serving as an intelligence officer in Afghanistan, to me, the use of the Russian language was really more important than even my reasonable knowledge of Farsi or Dari. And I think this explains a great deal about what is fundamentally wrong with much of the international system, that I was not at all unique in viewing the situation in that way. Afghanistan for years, and not only Afghanistan, but for years, has been viewed really as a kind of pawn in the international game. Afghanistan as a country in its own right did not really matter compared to its position as a pawn or instrument on the international scene. And we see that right down to today, that the considerations of so-called international politics are viewed as more important and indeed more natural. That's the worst word, more natural than it would be to focus on what the state of Afghanistan itself is. So I think this is the first lesson that we need to focus on as we wish to try to resolve some of these pressing, urgent, desperate problems even in Afghanistan and elsewhere in the world. Many people would say, well, this is typical. I mean, the great powers always look after their own interests. This is the nature of their foreign policy. But I would question not that statement so much as the question, what are the interests of the great powers or smaller powers in that region? It's easy to say, to quote, to throw out this idea of national interests, but what are national interests? This is what the grand debates are about in all countries of the world, including the United States. What are the national interests of the United States or of Russia or of China, et cetera, et cetera? When the national interests are framed primarily in terms of confrontation and international chess games, then you have one outcome. If you have another interpretation of the national interests, which would be for greater stability and the opportunity to avoid conflict with other countries, either inside Afghanistan or outside, then you have a very different approach to the issue. So I guess what I'm saying here is that we all as human beings need to work on a more humanitarian vision of what the world is all about. You can say that's naive, that it doesn't does not consist of realpolitik. But if you interpret realpolitik as something that should preserve greater degrees of stability around the world and avoid conflict and avoid human suffering, then that is, in my view, also a very powerful form of realpolitik. How long will the United States feel that it can impose various litmus tests on Afghanistan, or for that matter, on other countries of the world, litmus tests, before it is willing to cooperate with them? What kind of litmus test are they imposing, especially on a country that they had helped to destroy in the course of 20 years of constant warfare in Afghanistan? So in the end, I think we need to have this concept, and I think Helga touched on this considerably as well, a broader and more enlightened view of what the nature of international relations is going to be. It's unfortunate that from the American perspective today, at least three of the countries with which America should and indeed must cooperate are officially in the category of hostile or enemy states, namely China, namely Russia, namely Iran. We might even consider possibly Pakistan in this category, although not as much. But what kind of cooperation can you have when the three countries that are most intimately involved in this situation are unofficially viewed as hostile and enemy states to U.S. interests? I would argue that there's no solution, certainly no humanitarian solution or even political solution to this problem as long as that attitude prevails. So far, I see no great change in this regard. The United States is itself undergoing a period of great crisis, domestic crisis. I don't mean domestic politics, but in accepting the nature of a changing geopolitical world in which the United States is no longer able to fully dominate or dictate or direct the nature of all elements of international relations. This is a very painful recognition for Washington after some 20, 30, 40, 50, one might even say since the end of World War II, dominating role of the United States. It has not all been bad over that long period of time, but if we go back to particularly the fall of the Soviet Union or 9/11 for that matter, then this kind of political mentality has increasingly dominated American thinking, American policy thinking, and indeed brought disaster to its own foreign policy in many places in the world. But Afghanistan, and people have mentioned at this excellent discussion, Syria, Yemen might be yet another consideration, where very narrow-minded, narrow interpretations of the American or the international interests are prevailing instead of a broader vision of a more humanitarian, but more humanitarian, that's idealism, more stable world in which conflict and war are not so present, and the risks of confrontation are far less. I don't think those are idealistic goals. I think those are extremely practical national interests, not only of the US, but of Russia and China and European states and others as well as we look into the future. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bram. And I see we've been joined by the fourth panelist, Ivan Safranchuk, the director of the Center for Eurasian Studies at MGIMO University. Ivan, you have 10 minutes to give a presentation.
Thank you, colleagues. I'm very sorry for joining you with this delay. However, I see an opportunity in this delay because now I have the chance to endorse my very big support to what has just been said by Graham. I very much sense in his call for more common views the times when I was very young person, and I understand Mr. Fuller was already quite a man in his most active years. I mean the times of perestroika and early 90s. I was very young, and I remember very much how that atmosphere was different from what had been before and what has been after that, and that's why mindset is also important. Not only some core interests and historic interests, but their ability to take fresh approaches. Unfortunately, we are not anywhere close to more cooperative mindset. We are very much now in the great game competition, global great game competition, and increasing elements of regional competitions. In Afghanistan, right now, we do not have active competition between great powers. But we have a very unfortunate situation when Western countries, after withdrawing their troops, are going to abandon Afghanistan. There is nothing new in this for me. I've been participating in various events, including in the events of the RIAC with various partners. And since last, September, October, in several events I was participating with RIAC, I was saying actually all the same, that after winter, most probably Afghanistan would be left on its own. Because Taliban would not demonstrate enough flexibility and softness to deal with the international community on the terms which international community had imposed, hoping that Taliban would be far more softer and moderate. So this mismatch, where Taliban is ready to move with its softness, and where the international community needs the Taliban to move to be able to cooperate with it after various conditions had been imposed, this mismatch is still very big, and it is uncoverable. And I was thinking that this is going to happen in this way since last September. And unfortunately, I'm very unfortunate that I'm tending to be right in this regard. The humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan does take place, no question about it. But this humanitarian crisis is not of that scale that the Western community feels shame and rushes to do something for Afghanistan. Afghanistan is going to be left very much on its own. And by now, we have fully shaped the situation when there is a small group of countries which do not want the government of Afghanistan to ultimately collapse. This group includes, of course, Pakistan, also Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Russia, China, and Iran also lean toward this group, although with some conditions and maybe not fully. But clearly, these three countries.
Oops. Ivan, we appear to have lost you. Dave, is there anything you can do? All right, we can come back to Ivan. So we're now going to open the discussion period. And I'd like to see first if there are any comments that, Ivana, did you just reconnect?
Yes, sorry.
It's okay, go ahead, let's see if it works.
Some problems with institutional internet. So there is group of countries which are sort of positively or negatively neutral, but I think that there is a chance that there will be a group of countries who may become interested in the government of Taliban to collapse, to try to make Afghanistan a regional problem, a problem for Russia, China, and Pakistan, first of all, maybe also for Iran. And then we will have a very active regional competition. I think that everyone understands now that although Afghanistan is a regional problem, and we are living in the situation when problems are going to be mostly regional, no question about it. But I think that there will be in some time a choice for regional countries. In particular, if the crisis is facilitated by outside places, whether to take all the consequences on ourselves or to help to transit some of these consequences to other countries. I don't want to go too deep into this, but I want to remind you of the refugee crisis, which was so rudely developing on the border between Belarus and Poland in November. And this is the consequences of the Afghan crisis will also exist. And I'm sure that if outside players will try to manipulate regional problems of Afghanistan against regional countries, there will be opportunities to unleash consequences of the regional countries in the way that they reach not only regional countries, but go beyond the region. And I think that what was going on the border between Belarus and Poland is a good example of how it may develop. But it's only one way. I'm sure there are other ways so that consequences reach everyone, but not only those who are left facing.
Well, we seem to have lost Ivan again. I think we will go into the question and answer discussion session. Now, let me say that if there is time for questions from the audience, we can take written questions at schillerinstitute.org. And there are a couple of written questions. We'll see if we have time to get to them. What I'd like to do is open the conversation between the panelists and see if there are various reactions to what you've heard. I'd like to start with Andrey. Andrey, are you there? Dave, do you know, is Andrey still there? Okay, well, maybe we can come back to him, then start with Helga, if you have some comments from what you've heard from the various panelists.
Yes, I think I want to pick up on something Ivan said, even if he's not there right now, but he said that he thinks that, let me just address you, then we can start the discussion. Ivan said that he thinks that the humanitarian crisis is not of a scale that the West feels ashamed, so much ashamed to do something about it. That is actually not true. The actual real humanitarian crisis is absolutely the worst one on the planet. The figures I said in the beginning are all official figures from the UN, from the World Food Programme, from UNICEF. So about the objective condition, there is no question. And, you know, the fact that it's not reported by the mainstream media since about mid-September is the main reason they're trying to keep the lid on the situation, because, you know, once you admit what the actual situation is, you know, there would not be just a discussion about did Biden, you know, be a failure by pulling out in such a sudden way, you know, leaving all the so-called auxiliary forces behind, and all of this discussion which occurred end of August. But there would be a real upsetness in the world population, especially in the Islamic countries, in, you know, the so-called developing countries. And that is why the media is trying to suppress the information. And, you know, the whole purpose of Operation Ibn Sina is to awaken the world public to the dimension of the humanitarian crisis and evoke this kind of, you know, Empfindungsvermögen, you know, which is a German word created by the greatest German poet Schiller, which I have not found a good English translation. Empathy is getting close, but it's more. It's the ability to passionately love humanity and not allow that genocide is occurring, because, and it's really, I think it's not so accidental, because, as I said in my initial remarks, when the NATO forces pulled out and all the donor money was cut, everybody knew that this would collapse the Afghan economy right there. I mean, this was even mentioned by Prime Minister Imran Khan at the recent conference of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in Islamabad, where he said everybody knew that this was happening. So I think that I don't want to say, the Damocles sword which is hanging over the Western countries is that this will all hit them back in force. I mean, in the Nazi period, it was asked, when did they know? What did they know? At the Nuremberg Tribunal, there was the question of what was known about the crimes going on. And right now, when you could very easily help by just releasing the funds which are held by the US and European banks, there comes the question of guilt. And I know this is not very popular what I'm saying, but I think we have to get a little bit more, energetic in not allowing something which is incredible. And I really would, not say this is not a question of just commenting on something. This is the question of mobilizing the forces internationally to remedy an intolerable situation.
Mr. Chairman, may I have one word in reaction to this, maybe a minute?
Sure.
I don't want to argue on the exact scale of the crisis and how it is framed and characterized by the media and by the UN officials. I want to address your last thesis on releasing Afghan funds in their foreign jurisdictions. I think that the call for release of these funds is probably the right call from juridical perspective. Although from juridical perspective, exactly, we cannot release them because Taliban is under international sanctions. But I think that even if we try to push for it, it's a way to nowhere. Because from the moral perspective, nobody takes Afghan avoirs in Western or Eastern banks as Afghan avoirs. This is money of Western taxpayers. This is donor money, which is just registered as if it is Afghan avoirs in Western bank. So I think there will be a huge resistance to releasing this money because this is not actually Western money. There were cases when, for example, Pakistan's money or Iranian money were frozen in Western banks. Then no question, this is money of Pakistan and of Iran. Many money generated by their labor, by their resources, and so on and so on. But in the Afghan case, how will you say this is Afghan money? This is just a formality that this is Afghan money. Actually, this is money of the Western taxpayers given to the previous government. That's why I think there will be no release, just no question about it. But I have another proposal, what can be provided to Afghanistan. There is money, there are hundreds of millionaires and multimillionaires who became millionaires, Afghan millionaires, who became millionaires being part of the previous regime. And it is very clear that most of the money they have, and they have money in Eastern banks, in Western banks, most of these millionaires have money actually stolen from Western taxpayers. And I think that if there is problem of returning Afghan money, Afghan avoirs, Afghan governmental avoirs frozen in Western banks, there should be no problem about going after corrupted officials and corrupted businessmen associated with the Afghan government of the previous regime, to go after them in Germany, in United Arab Emirates, in the United States, in Canada, in all places where they saved this money, actually stolen from Western taxpayers. And I think that exactly this money should be taken away from these people, concentrated in an international fund, and under international control, being provided to whatever government of Afghanistan. Taliban government, non-Taliban government, but whatever government of Afghanistan.
All right, well, this raises a question, though, that we did receive a question from Fanny Dellinger from the University of Innsbruck that anyone could take. If Andrey is there, I'd like him to take it, but if not, anyone could take it. What do you think is the appropriate level of engagement with the Taliban then? Because part of the reason for withholding funds is people say they don't want to give it to the Taliban. Someone have a thought on that? Graham, you want to say something? Yeah, go ahead. You have to unmute.
I mean, I think at this point we have to look at what the options and alternatives are. At the present time, there is no alternative to the Taliban being in power. Somebody earlier on mentioned that they had been a terrorist organization. I think that's not a fully accurate description of the nature of the Taliban. This was a long-standing part of a long-standing 20, 30-year civil war within Afghanistan, within which the Taliban represented, in particular, Pashtun nationalist feelings. Not all Pashtuns by any means, but largely Pashtun. So I think that war is over. Any alternative would be fairly dreadful organizations that several of the speakers have already mentioned, of Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any of these groups. So, and furthermore, even to think in these terms suggests a search for alternative forces, which means really reopening the civil war yet again. And I don't think there's any benefit for anybody in reopening it, or that somehow that we will find a wonderful pro-Western government that believes in all the so-called values of the West to be put into practice there. I just don't think there are realistic alternatives at the moment, and we have to live with this. What litmus test we can apply to Afghanistan or other regimes in the world become very problematic if it becomes too ideological.
Temur, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I also want to add, I think here we should think about what are our goals. We want to solve the humanitarian crisis as soon as possible, or we want to reach some kind of fairness or justice here. If we talk about justice, yes, of course, we should not give any kind of money to the Taliban, to wait that the Taliban would become some, kind of fair, I don't know, inclusive government and stuff like that. But it will not solve the crisis right now. We should choose from several evils, and the lesser one, and the most effective way of solving the crisis is to giving the Taliban the money that is already there in the banks, just are frozen right now. Yes, of course, this is the money of Western taxpayers, but the finances that were stolen by corrupt administration of Ghani is also the Western taxpayers' money. But it's really difficult right now to make them give this money to the Taliban or in any ways to take this money back from them. So if we really are talking right now about solving the crisis that is unfolding at this moment as we talk, we should, I think, choose the instruments that we have in handy.
Jim, in your talk, the idea of stopping the continuing war on Afghanistan, do you see this policy of withholding funds and the continuing sanctions as part of continuing the war?
Yes, absolutely. It's hard to talk about what we can do for Afghanistan until we stop doing things to Afghanistan. It's not just a failure to do something for the people of Afghanistan. I think Graham and others have pointed out that the neighboring countries all have one interest in common, whether we're talking about Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, the Russians, the Chinese, the Pakistanis, the Indians, the Iranians. If they have any sense at all, they would want to see Afghanistan as stable and not a problem for the neighborhood. It seems to me that the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is the proper venue for the neighboring countries to think about what's the best way to manage the question of Afghanistan. What are the American and British interests in Afghanistan? Zero, zip, zilch. We have no interests in this part of the world. But unfortunately, the people making policy in the West see an interest in trying to disrupt any kind of agreement on stability for Afghanistan. And I think inflicting humanitarian crisis on Afghanistan, just like as Graham pointed out, we do with respect to Yemen, is simply seen as a policy tool. It's a form of siege warfare that can cause a lot of misery, a lot of instability, give a hot foot to the neighbors by creating this mess there or perpetuating this mess and stopping these countries from coming together in a humane way. Helga and Ivan were kind of disagreeing on whether or not there's a humanitarian crisis that will shame the Western countries. Well, you can't shame the shameless. You simply keep a lid on it and try to ignore it, like we've done in Afghanistan, in Yemen and other places. So I think before we can talk about a positive agenda, what can you do? You can lead, you can follow, you can get out of the way. And what the Western countries can do right now is get out of the way, release the funds, accept the fact that we lost some people we don't particularly like or in control, but there's somebody else's problem right now. They're the neighboring country's problem. They shouldn't be our problem anymore, and we shouldn't be trying to make the problem worse, which is what we are continuing to do, in my opinion.
Well, Jim, you brought up the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I'd like to ask Helga about this proposal that came from a Chinese military analyst, Zhao Bo. He said it's now time to bring Afghanistan in as a full member of the SCO. Do you have any thoughts on that? You're muted, Helga. You have to unmute.
Yes, 1 second. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I think the SCO is a very good framework to integrate Afghanistan. In any case, the only sign of hope right now is the fact that the OIC, for example, they plan to have another regional development meeting beginning of March on the development of Afghanistan. Also, when Imran Khan was just in Beijing, they discussed Afghanistan, and there will be a regional development conference in Beijing also beginning of March. So I think one can see that the neighbors all have a very clear interest to stabilize the situation, and the SCO would be the larger security and economic framework to do that. So that part is good, but I still maintain my initial point that first of all, if the United States and NATO occupy a country for 20 years and conduct war, they have a moral responsibility, including, the idea that the money is now in the US and European banks is Western taxpayer money. Well, if you are for 20 years in a country, and when you leave, still 80% of the budget are coming from taxpayer money, you did something wrong. I mean, they should have built up the country and leave a prospering nation and not a field of rubble. So I think there is a moral obligation to release this money because, you can't just, I find this extremely upsetting, the idea that this is European or Western taxpayer money. The other thing is, as I said, if we can solve Afghanistan in the small, in getting all the countries to cooperate, it may be a stepping stone to diffuse the large strategic crisis which we see right now, especially over Ukraine and in a different way with Taiwan. And I'm not giving this up because I still believe we have to arrive at a new paradigm in international relations of cooperation instead of confrontation. So for me, I'm not just looking at Afghanistan, I'm looking at Afghanistan both in terms of the humanitarian crisis, but also, you know, as a hopeful way to build bridges in the large domain.
Well, what you just said reflects another question that we just got in, which is someone who raises this issue of, could there be cooperation in Afghanistan? Could that be something that could affect the broader picture, including Ukraine and Taiwan? I'd like to see, Ivan, if you have a thought on that, Temur, if you have a thought on that. Unmute yourself.
Cooperation on what?
Cooperation and humanitarian aid, and then rebuilding the country.
I'm quite pessimistic. I support all the calls for that, but I don't believe that, as Jim said, suddenly shameless will change the mind. I want to, already for a while, I usually make comparison between Afghanistan and Syria. Actually, the attitude of Western countries to Syria is even more hypocritical and unfair than it is to Afghanistan. At least in Afghanistan, you can say that the Taliban, its leaders, are under international sanctions. There may be discussion whether they are terrorists or they just assisted some terrorists, and so on and so on. But in Syria, you have a legitimate government, internationally recognized. You have the US troops, which occupy part of this country in the north and control oil resources, a big part of oil resources of this country, and deprive the country of the oil revenue. And I do not believe that suddenly in Afghanistan, some countries will play in a more fair way than in Syria. That's why I think that it's quite unrealistic, and in internal debates in these countries, it will be the question will be raised. Look, why do we cooperate with the Taliban if we are so much pressing Assad in Syria? Whether Taliban is better than Assad, everyone will say, of course, no. So I don't believe that soon it's possible that there will be some positive international agenda on Afghanistan, even on humanitarian issues, let alone on reconstruction of the country. I think the best what we can now achieve is avoiding a serious competition when foreigners, when faraway countries will really impede efforts of regional countries to stabilize the country, to stabilize Afghanistan. That is something what we still can avoid. Okay. Even this will be very hard, but big international positive agenda on Afghanistan with involvement of various countries, no, I think that is very difficult at this point.
Well, let me see. Andrey, are you there? Dr. Kortunov? If you're there, you're muted. We can come back to him. I know he's going to be. Hello? Temur, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, maybe just add to the thought about international cooperation on Afghanistan. I also do not see Afghanistan as a place where great powers will find a consensus. I mean, we're in the middle of pandemic, and in the very beginning of it, it seemed that it's, a perfect enemy for the countries to cooperate. Something even more, perfect than the pandemic could be aliens coming to the earth. But even the pandemic could not make big powers to cooperate I don't think that Afghanistan will be the exception here.
Well, let me go into a slightly broader question then for all the panelists. To the extent there seems to be some pessimism, we're actually dealing with a situation in Ukraine right now where we see a real danger of a confrontation, largely as a result of this continued Western war drive. How do we overcome this? I mean, what President Putin has called for is new security architecture based on guarantees of security. I know Helga's written a lot about this. I want to hear from Helga on that, but see who else has some thoughts on this. So Helga, you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are in a very quick, fast-changing situation, and that will also impact the situation in Afghanistan in ways which has not yet been touched upon in this discussion so far. Look at the historic agreement which was just made between President Xi Jinping and President Putin in the context of the Olympic Games, reaching very far-reaching partnerships in economics, in even touching on military questions. And that has actually started a new dynamic because, there is right now a clear counterpole to the previous insistence on the unipolar world. And many countries are feeling attracted by what is offered by this combination in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, in terms of actual models to overcome poverty and underdevelopment. And I'm an optimist, and I'm not an optimist because I believe in tea leaves. I'm an optimist because I believe in actively organizing for a vision you have. And I think we are in such a period, where many people know we are on the brink of potential extinction. If you look at the insane, conceptions of the global lightning maneuver, which just took place, many people are waking up that we need a new paradigm. And I think the discussion of a new Helsinki 2, which is now occurring very actively in Germany, the idea that you need a European new security architecture, which includes Russia. I have added to that because of this Russia-China agreement, we have to have an international security architecture which includes every country, including Russia, China, the United States. And it can be only made on the basis of joint economic development, because a security architecture which is not based on joint economic interest has no chance of being durable in existence. So I think we should, rather than despairing about unsolvable crises and so on, I think there are so many processes in motion, and the question is how to influence them. And on the argument of that the shameless are not to be shamed into changing, well, I'm happy to say that even in Germany or in Europe or in the United States, not everybody is shameless. And what Operation Ibn Sina appeals to is those people who feel like that they are humanists, and there are still some people who think that the human species should be behaving in a human way. So I just want to spread some optimism that if you have a clear idea where mankind should be, and you mobilize forces to go in the direction of realizing that you may add some positive to the course of world history and not sit there being pessimistic.
Well, on that note, we had a message of greetings to this event from Alessia Ruggieri, who's from the Comitato per la Repubblica in Italy, who sends her greetings and raises the question of the Italian government. That again, we come to this problem that they've not recognized the Taliban, but they're using the issue of women's rights. And she writes that this seems to be a pretext to starve the whole population. Isn't that, I'd like to ask everyone to comment on this, doesn't that represent, in some way, you see all these people talking about, the plight of women, and yet withholding aid means women and children are starving. Can we use this hypocrisy to move governments, and in particular the European governments, anyone can take that question. Jim, did you want to say something?
Just very briefly. I share agree with what Helga is saying. If she were the Secretary of State, I think we'd be in much better shape than we are. Unfortunately, we've got Tony Blinken, and I just don't see. I agree with Helga. There are a lot of people in various countries, I think maybe more in Europe than in the United States, who would want to respond to these, what we might call universal human values that have a humane content. Unfortunately, those are not the people who are running things, that they're institutionally locked into a mindset that looks at the world in terms of a geopolitical zero-sum game. Their interest in Afghanistan is disrupt Eurasia. Their interest in Ukraine and trying to stop Nord Stream 2 is block Europe's and especially Germany's integration in Eurasia. And I hope there are people in Italy and Germany and places like this, but ultimately comes down to the vision and courage of the leaders, and especially in Europe, to finally, with a gerbil, finally jump off the treadmill, or they just keep doing what they've been doing that have gotten us into this mess in the first place. And as Helga says, we're getting very close to the clock ticking toward midnight here. And the people who have the levers of power are just not the right ones who are going to get us out of this.
Graham, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I agree with all that's been said in this regard. I don't have a great deal of hope for see change in U.S. policies or outlook for some time to come. But I do have more hope for Europe, Western Europe in particular, that can begin to help unfreeze the rather frozen zero-sum political vision that dominates the United States right now, particularly Germany, classically close to Eastern Europe, closer to the realities of Russia and politics of that area than almost any other country, and also more powerful at this point to do that. So I'm hoping that although there's all this drum beating right now for NATO unity and all of this, I think many observers sort of have the feeling that NATO is really a dying force. It served its purpose very well when you had a Soviet Union that was perhaps bent on changing the game in Europe, especially back in the days of Stalin. But those days are long gone, and one can argue that a force like NATO is actually creating greater confrontation, indeed is creating greater confrontation than almost any other force. So I'd look especially to Germany, but also to France. Forget about the UK. The UK is now very much wannabe American, Tony Blair, lapdog, or whatever you want to call it. But I certainly think in terms of most of Western European nations have a clearer view and need to speak out and get itself out from under the pressures of singing all from the same NATO hymn book, because that's not going to get us anywhere. It's going to take us in the wrong direction.
Let me offer Yvonne a chance to comment on this general discussion. Besides being somewhat pessimistic about the West, it's clear something has to be done. Do you have some idea of how to break the logjam?
On Afghanistan, or more generally on Ukraine and this standoff between Russia and the West?
Well, let's take Afghanistan, since that's the subject of our event.
I think that the United States will be more positive, more positively engaged with Afghanistan if there is no regional partner for the United States to to impede regional efforts. Because still the United States is far away, and usually when we see the United States and European countries operating some way in Eurasia, usually a local partner is very much needed. Right now we have two dissonance voices in the region about Afghanistan. This is Tajikistan, which is far more cautious on the Taliban government than its neighbors. And I want to stress that Tajikistan has good reasons to be very cautious. Although we now say that the Taliban should not be pressed too much, we still should admit that actually the Taliban established the regime within which nobody of us would like to live. They established social conditions. I can hardly imagine that anybody from this panel would like to live in the social conditions which they established in their country. And the old rule that if you are aggressive inside the country, you may finally become aggressive to your neighbors and outside your country, that rule is not gone. And that rule is based on the history of Europe and the world from the mid of the previous and from the first half of the previous century. That's why Tajikistan has reasons to be very concerned with the government of Taliban and to be very cautious, no question about it. And India is also ambivalent on the government of Taliban. They take it as reality, but they definitely do not like this reality. So if regional countries fail to reach regional consensus, and there will be regional countries who are ready to help faraway foreigners with some destructive agenda, that will be an opportunity for destructive agenda of outside powers. And that's why, although now a lot of attention is paid to positively re-engage in the West in Afghanistan, unfreezing Afghan avoirs and taking other efforts. Once again, I do not believe that this is going to succeed, but all that right. But I still think that the most critical is to have a regional consensus, if not full consensus, then at least a big level of regional common understanding. And then this will be a good hedge against destructive activities of outsiders.
Well, let me throw something in. We have a comment from Shah Merabi, who's an economist from the Afghan Central Bank. And he said, the long-term solution to the current economic crisis entails not only addressing the humanitarian crisis, but economic and banking paralysis. The immediate release of Afghan frozen assets to stabilize prices and reduce volatility is essential. Development aid and involvement of regional powers, as well as multilateral assistance to address development needs of the country, should be given immediate attention. Now, with all that's been said, Temur, you have some thoughts on that, the importance of getting a breakthrough on this, because part of the problem, I spoke to a Pakistani journalist who spends a lot of time in Afghanistan, who said that it's not only that there's not food available, but people have no money. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just add for another time that the humanitarian crisis, we can, of course, speculate on that, whether it's a catastrophic situation or not catastrophic enough situation, but I think there is a consensus among us that the situation with Afghan society is not good. and something should be done with that from the point of view of international society, but also it's just a pragmatic way to not let the situation get worse, so it will impact the neighboring countries. But unfortunately, it seems that we're in the situation where the Afghanistan people are left on their own, and any country beside any country around Afghanistan doesn't have enough instruments to help Afghanistan to cope with this, but other countries who have enough resources are not willing to spend them on Afghan crisis. And my observation here is that the situation in the short term will get even worse, and there is nothing to be expected from the international community here, unfortunately.
Well, that paradox sort of puts the ball back in our court, that we have to mobilize to create the incentive for Western governments and the larger powers to get involved. We're running toward the end. I'm not sure. I was told that Andrey may be having some technical problems. So maybe if we can get a short final summary from Graham and Jim, and then Helga, you can make a closing statement. So Graham?
Yeah, I think a lot has been said here, and a lot of very important things have been said, and I agree with almost all of it. I view, as was clear from my remarks, that the U.S. in particular, and maybe Europe, NATO in general, has tended to have maintain this Cold War mentality that prevents, I think, from viewing Afghanistan in Afghan terms, or viewing any country, Yemen or Syria or others, viewing them in terms of their own problems, not just humanitarian, but in terms of maintaining stability, which ultimately helps prevent broader clash and confrontation, military and otherwise, internationally. Again, I have to come back to Europe. I think the United States is undergoing a period of huge psychological trauma, of having to come to terms with the fact that it is no longer now able to dictate or mold the opinion of all the rest of the world and expect it to follow. It's painful for it to acknowledge that there are other major states in the world that have increasing voice in this. Here is where, again, I come back to Europe, because I think that Europe, which is viewed as obviously friendlier territory to Washington than say Central Asia or East Asia or whatever, Europe is in a position to help America face this transition to an acceptance of a much more multilateral world, in which ultimately not every country has to be viewed in terms of what does it mean for the grand international struggle. And that was the point of my beginning my remarks just in Russian, was to say that it's incredible to think that Russian should have been more on my mind as an intelligence officer in Kabul, even back in the 70s, showing how much the true domestic issues were not viewed as important. It was the great game, which, as we all know, goes back a very long time. So I look to Europe for helping nurse the U.S. through this very painful psychological period. Germany above all else, but France, also Italy, and other countries. But it's going to be primarily, I think, in the West, Western Europe, that that can facilitate this American psychological transition.
Thank you, Graham. I see we have Andrey back. We're now ready for closing remarks, and we'll start with Andrey, your thoughts.
Thank you, Harley. I think that our discussion suggests that the humanitarian dimension of the Afghan situation remains a very important challenge to the international community. And unfortunately, the community is not united on these issues. And it's not likely that we will have a consensus on what's going on in Afghanistan and what we can do about Afghanistan. Nevertheless, that should not prevent us from uniting in trying to render humanitarian assistance to the country. I think that there are many technical issues here that we have to address in terms of how this assistance can be rendered and how the situation in Afghanistan can be managed without compromising the principles and the demands that the international community might have regarding Afghanistan. I do believe that it's important to continue our dialogue. It's important to keep channels of communications open. And I do hope that specifically if we are talking about the Russian-EU interaction, there are ways to come to some kind of common denominators on what can and what should be done in terms of continuing the humanitarian assistance to the country and setting a consorted list of demands or suggestions that the international community might have regarding the Taliban leadership. In my view, this year is likely to be critical in terms of the ability of Taliban or inability of Taliban to consolidate its power in the country. And my personal conclusion is that any alternative is likely to be worse than the current regime of Taliban. Therefore, it is in our common interest to make sure that Taliban succeeds, not fails. Later on, we can consider other demands or other suggestions that might guide our policies towards the government in Kabul. But for the time being, I think the humanitarian considerations should take the priority above all other considerations that we might have about developments in this country. Well, thank you for a very interesting and very provocative discussion that we had today.
Well, thank you, Andrey. And now we'll go to Helga Zepp-LaRouche for her closing remarks.
Well, I agree with you, Andrey, that one has to start with the humanitarian crisis. I mean, I for sure would not like to live under a Taliban government. But, you know, if you think the situation through, the alternatives are all worse, ranging from destabilization, prolonged civil war, more misery for a country where the people have suffered for 40 years to live under war. And I think I can only start to imagine what it means for 2 generations, you know, to be under permanent war. I mean, I think we have to start with a very, very compassionate, you know, participating in the fate of the Afghan people and start with the dignity of actually sacredness of each human life, you know, and there is no difference between an Afghan baby and a baby in the United States or in Germany. You know, it's the love of the parents and it's the hope of the future of the country. So I think if we start with the humanitarian question first, and then say, you know, we need a twofold approach. We need first an international mobilization for humanitarian aid, medicine, food. Food is medicine in this situation. food shipments must occur, medical supply must be brought there. We need to build a modern health system. We have COVID, we have all these other epidemics. So we need hospitals. The Operation Ibn Sina is an effort to make partnerships between hospitals in the United States and Europe and clinics in Afghanistan to train young people to be auxiliary forces to building a modern health system. That should be the first level. And then the second level is naturally the building of the economy of Afghanistan. And that can only occur by integrating, Afghanistan with the projects which are already in the region as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. That is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which must be extended into Afghanistan. That is the building of the cyber pass, which will also connect Afghanistan with its neighbors. Then you have the older project of the Pak-Af-Us. This is a train project which must be revived. And by building infrastructure, basic infrastructure, electricity, water, transport, help the Afghan people not to produce opium, but produce agricultural production. All of that can be done. We have the help of Pino Alaki, who was the UN representative working with the Taliban in 2000. And he witnessed, he was the Deputy General Secretary of the United Nations in charge of fighting the opium everywhere. And he said it is quite possible to work with the Taliban, but the international community, if we don't want to have more dead people from the drug traffic, we should help the Taliban to not build, not have opium production, but agricultural production, solve the hunger crisis. There must be an industrialization of Afghanistan. And I can only say, rather than despairing about the situation as it is, which is pretty bad, I think we should take this idea of Operation Ibn Sina and actively bring it, to the Western countries and appeal to them to make a step and help. I know that the response to Operation Ibn Sina from the Islamic countries was very strong. We have now requests from, people in hospitals in many countries in the region who say we need that same approach. We are in a similar desperate situation. If you look at the movie which was made by David Beasley from the World Food Program called Hunger Ward, which is the dying of children in hospitals in Yemen. I mean, if you see that and your heart is not breaking, you are not a human being. And I'm really emphatic on that. So let's just put our efforts together and really get a whole movement for development, peace through development. I think that must be our slogan.
Well, thank you, Helga. And let me thank all of the participants in the discussion today. I want to give a special thanks to Ivan Pochadov for helping to pull it together and for David DeBroek for doing the technical work. And obviously we have a lot of work in front of us to do. Let's take this as a starting point for moving toward this higher level of cooperation of peace through development. Thank you, and we'll see everyone soon.